This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Hey, Joe Walsh, former Congressman Joe Walsh. This is White Flag with Joe Walsh. Listen wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every week I sit down with somebody who I think disagrees with me about something. And I've got somebody on right now with me who is one of my favorite legal followers on Twitter, Bradley Moss. We all should follow him on Twitter, at Brad Moss ESQ. A very prominent national security attorney. You see him on TV a whole bunch, MSNBC, CNN, all the rest, talking legal issues. Brad, my friend, thank you for joining me. I wanted to bring you on. I'm not a lawyer, and this whole notion of, and you know how I feel about Trump.
Oh, yes.
This whole notion as a non-lawyer of a gag order just kind of infuriates me and just rubs my First Amendment beliefs so wrong. I wanted to bring you on to see if you could explain what this is and if it makes sense. There was a gag order placed on Trump this week. Good idea, bad idea?
So
Talk to me.
It was a really narrow gag order,
Yeah.
let's be clear. And the only reason this came up was because of Trump's own actions. So this isn't a criminal case. It's not like the one in D.C. or in Florida
Right.
or in Georgia. This is a civil matter. And so generally speaking, there wouldn't be a need for gag orders. But what Trump did, what he stupidly did, was he went and attacked the judge's clerk. And he identified her by name, and he doxed her social media handles, and he made various false statements about her. Judges basically don't really care much about what you say about them. They're used to it. They could take action. They generally won't bother, especially when it be such obvious political implications like it would be with Donald Trump. And they wasn't really any interest in doing so when it came to the attacks on Letitia James. But he went after the clerk. He went after the judge's staff. The judge has to protect his staff, and that was just a bridge too far. And it seems to have left its mark. There's been no commentary from Donald Trump since that gag order was put in place in any way referencing the staff or the judge's clerk again, which is good. And look, this is someone, we both have our views on Donald Trump and our distaste for him. Yeah. But I think the one thing we can definitely agree on is he's someone who's never faced accountability in his life. He's never been held to account for anything he's done. There's always been a way to work around it. He declared bankruptcy. Oh, he actually made a great deal, and don't worry, he's just fine. He's got tons of money. He lost an election. Oh, it was all stolen from me. Someone else did it. He's never been held to account for anything in his life. This was a judge saying, enough's enough. Now, what we have to wait and see on is what Judge Chutkan does in D.C. next week.
So to be specific, as what you just said, Judge Engoron in Trump's civil fraud trial, responding to a shot that Trump took against his clerk, issued a gag order forbidding all parties to speak about his staff. Again, a very narrow gag order, but Brad, what does that mean? Does that mean Trump couldn't comment on a member of his staff?
Yeah, Trump can't make any remarks, particularly any defamatory or any negative remarks regarding the judge's staff, his clerks, anyone else who supports the judge. And it's in the context of what we normally consider the phrase, the orderly administration of justice. You have been brought here as a party before this court. You will respect the court. You will respect the system of the judiciary, and you will treat it with professionalism and respect. If you don't, you could be subject to various sanctions. One is the gag order. There's always the idea and the option of holding someone in contempt, which can obviously have prison time, which Judge Engoron really doesn't want to do with this. It's already politically controversial enough. The last thing he wants to do is be the first judge to throw Trump in jail. But so what he does is he hit him with a limited gag order. Yeah. It brought Trump down to size.
So why, all right, let me push you. This bothers me. What if the judge's clerk is a longtime Democratic activist? Can't Trump say that?
No, because one, it's completely irrelevant to the case. Because the only reason to bring that up, whether the person was a longtime Democrat, longtime Republican, independent, I don't care if it was a QAnon libertarian lunatic, it's a member of the judicial staff. It's a person supporting the judge in performing his duties, administering the case. You can talk to the end of time about how you are innocent, about how these facts don't line up under the law. That's fine. The judge didn't stop it there. Judge Chutkan, even if she does agree to the gag order in D.C., she's not going to stop that in D.C. But what they are not going to allow him to do is to continue to try to launch political assaults on the judicial staff, because at some point, you have to respect the institution.
So this seems fascinating to me, my lawyer friend, and it still bothers. To me, it seems unconstitutional. He is a candidate for office. He's going to be the Republican Party nominee. He can say, can he say that, oh my God, look at, I'm being persecuted. All of these indictments are political bullshit. He's got a right to say stuff like that, doesn't he?
Yeah, and none of these gag orders, neither the one in New York nor the one that's being requested in D.C., would stop him from saying that. He could say to the end of time, he could put out posts on Truth Social, this is a political witch hunt, I'm innocent, here's the ways in which I'm innocent as a factual matter, as a legal matter, whatever. He could call it the coming communism till the end of time, and no one's going to care. He can attack
proof, though. Like, could he say this is a political witch hunt? And let me prove why. This judge's clerk is a longtime Democrat. The judge is a hardcore Democrat. See, this is a witch hunt.
Because, that's where the gag order is saying no, because there you're not attacking facts. You're attacking the person and you're attacking the institution. So what he's attacking the judge in New York on is he doesn't like the rulings. Great. Everybody who's ever been involved in a civil action at some point probably doesn't like the rulings at various times that the judge has given down or what the staff had drafted up for them. If you or I went into court and went outside the court and started yelling that stuff, we'd get hauled out in front of the judge and held in contempt for it, because you will respect the court. He's been given a lot more latitude than you or I would ever be given because he's Donald Trump. But in the end, that doesn't make him any more special than anybody else.
Has he been given latitude because he's a candidate for president? I mean, he's a candidate. He needs to speak about this stuff.
I think the judges have given a lot of latitude in light of the fact that he is a candidate, in light of the fact that he's a former president, and in light of the very big bully pulpit he has, and they want to respect the ability of the public to hear from him no matter what they do or don't think of his remarks. But there has to be a limit, and this is particularly the case. It was interesting the gag order came in the civil case because it's not a criminal one. In the criminal one, you're on pretrial release. You don't like the conditions on which you're being, restricted in terms of being out on pretrial release? I got a great, easy, fix for you. You can sit in jail until the trial. That's what everybody else has to deal with. If you don't like these restrictions imposed by the court, you were indicted. Whatever you think of the charges right now, they were issued by a grand jury. They haven't been thrown out yet. They remain standing. You are out at the grace of the court.
Do you have a problem if, say, Judge Engoron was a longtime Democratic donor and activist, say he was, Trump wouldn't have a First Amendment right to just acknowledge that?
It would be no different than, say, if someone went before the Supreme Court and decided that they were going to start publicly attacking Justice Thomas or Justice, Alito or any of them, saying, these are long-time, donors, or these are people who have been getting these fancy multi-million-dollar trips for free from all these people, from Leonard Leo and all these other guys. Clearly, they're corrupt. Clearly, and if I was the lawyer doing it, or if I was the person bringing a case before it, I could get in trouble for that. Yes, it might be factual.
To do, but would somebody have a right to do that, to say that?
Generally speaking, no. If you are a party before the court, you have to respect the court in the sense of you cannot publicly and personally attack them in that context. Can you be sanctioned for it? Yes. Will they always do it? Not necessarily. But can they? Absolutely. There are limits to what you can do, especially in a criminal case, in terms of your ability to comment on the judges. Every judge has their own personal First Amendment right. They can donate to candidates if they want. There's no, just because they have that First Amendment, that doesn't take away anything from you, because if you're on pretrial release, you have to respect the court and their pretrial release conditions.
But it seems like, Brad, and tell me if you're troubled by this. And again, it's so good to talk to you because I'm a total layman here.
No, honestly.
And I cannot stand Trump. But it seems like because he's been indicted, he's got now, and he's been charged, and he's now going to be in front of judges and juries. He's got limits. There are additional First Amendment limits on him that wouldn't be placed on him if he wasn't on trial.
Correct, absolutely, and
That doesn't seem fair to me.
But that's the downside of having been indicted. If he didn't like it, well, first response is, well, one, don't commit the crime in the first place. But he has not been convicted of anything, so let's say he might be innocent. You've been indicted. It's been several months now.
Yeah.
If these are garbage charges as a matter of law, and you didn't even have to get in discovery, where's your motions to throw this stuff out? Notice they haven't filed any of those. The charges are still there. And this is the reality. And Judge Chutkan made this clear in the first hearing with Trump's lawyers when they were complaining about his ability to respond to attacks, and like, for instance, on a debate stage. She said, that's life. You're a criminal defendant. Get over it. You don't like these pretrial release conditions? There's a really simple solution. You can sit in jail. Then you won't be at the debate at all.
Okay, so stop there, my lawyer friend. If you're a criminal defendant in America, you lose some of your First Amendment rights.
You do. Stop
there.
Yeah.
That's fascinating to me, Brad, because that seems anathema to me.
You lose a number of rights. Depending on the basis of your charge, for instance, you could be subject to pretrial conditions saying you can't consume alcohol. There's no other law that would prevent you, the moment you hit 18 or 21, from consuming alcohol. But you could be a subject that would be something you'd be restricted from doing. You could be told you can't interact with certain people. Why? Because it's part of your pretrial release conditions. Doesn't matter. There's a First Amendment right to interact with other individuals. You have been released from detention back into the public despite an indictment at the grace of the court, subject to certain conditions. Sometimes there's monetary issues like a bail. Sometimes there's these various restrictions on your ability to interact with people. That is what any criminal defendant has to deal with. And Donald Trump has never known someone to hold him to account or hold him to conditions like that.
Very true. Okay, so if you're a criminal defendant, you lose some of your First Amendment rights. You could.
You could, yes, absolutely. Depending on the circumstances, there could be limits placed on it as a condition of being allowed back into the public.
Does that, and I know you're a lawyer, and does that seem fair to you? And I'm just solely focused on limiting speech.
Yeah, so the easiest way to address it is the idea that there's no easy balance here. You haven't been convicted of anything yet, but there was enough information for a grand jury to at least indict you. And you wanted to be released from detention. You were arrested, you were booked, you were fingerprinted and everything like that. You want out of jail. Well, to get out of jail, you have to meet these various certain conditions, and one of them is going to be whether these restrictions on what you can say. There's going to be restrictions on your ability to comment on the people who are prosecuting you, on the judge who is overseeing the case, on the witnesses who are going to testify against you. That's all tied into the orderly administration of justice, because without that, then every criminal defendant could start going out there and trying to poison jury pools when it came to the witnesses who will ultimately have to testify, who can't themselves respond because they're waiting to testify at trial, not in the court of public opinion.
So could Trump say that Judge Chutkan has a personal vendetta against him?
At the moment, yes. And as far as I'm concerned, even with what Jack Smith is seeking, I don't think that would necessarily run afoul of the gag order. I want to see what ultimately Judge Chutkan would sign off on. But there's definitely going to be far stricter language, not only about what Trump says when it comes to witnesses like General Milley or Mike Pence, but what he says about the various staffers, the various individuals prosecuting him and overseeing this case. There's got to be a limit. There's got to be a balance between his obvious ability to try to protest his innocence and to campaign, but even just as a private citizen to protest his innocence and as well balanced against the ability of the court and the justice system and the executive branch to prosecute this case, whatever it comes out of. If he thinks the case is garbage, what are you doing? You got millions of billions of dollars. You're the most wealthy person on the planet, according to him. File a damn motion and throw the case out. He hasn't, because he knows he's going to lose a trial.
But he can say he thinks the case is garbage.
Of course he can. He could protest his innocence till the end of time, even with the gag order that Judge Chutkan is considering.
Okay, so there are limits. To me, this seems really unfair as a non-lawyer and someone who, I hate Donald Trump. He's an existential threat to this democracy, but I'm a free speech absolutist. Is he being treated unfairly, Brad, because he's a candidate for president?
I think he's actually been given a lot more leeway and been treated with much more kid gloves given who he is. If this were anyone else charged under the Espionage Act with those obstruction provisions, there would be no bond. He'd be in prison right now. If this were anybody else charged with what he's charged in terms of the election interference case, it would have been a huge bond at a minimum before he was let out. A whole lot of those guys that were arrested tied to January 6th sat in prison awaiting trial. You know, the fact that they took as long as they did, that they jumped through as many hoops as they did to, cross every, T and dot every I before they brought the indictments, that was them basically trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Merrick Garland did not want to be bringing this case. No one wants to be the first one, overseeing a Justice Department prosecuting a former president. But when the person gives you no other choice and the facts are too damning, you unfortunately have to do that. But if this were anybody else aside from Donald Trump, and by that I mean not necessarily the man, but the embodiment of the person and the former president, he would have been indicted long before, and he would have been sitting in jail awaiting trial.
I agree with all of that, and I agree he's been treated with kid gloves compared to an average American. My focus, Brad, is when it comes to speech, and maybe this is hard to answer, but how common is it that a judge would place speech restrictions on a criminal defendant?
Happens all the time. Especially if that criminal defendant has made various attacks on the court, on witnesses, along those lines. And you and I would never hear about it for the most part, because it's handled usually at the state level, because that's where most of these cases ultimately are. And it's not high profile. The public doesn't generally hear about it. But if you were to start pulling various cases over the years of all the different criminal matters across the country, you'd see all types of restrictions. A lot of the times, if the judge feels like a gag order won't be enough, they'll just throw him in jail and say, you can sit there until this gets to trial. It might be 6 to 9 months. Too bad.
It's so interesting, Brad. And I think most people listening to us who don't have your background would have been either surprised or curious that as a criminal defendant, it does impact your speech, your First Amendment rights. How do we balance this then? This is a problem because he's going to be the Republican Party nominee. These trials, these are going to be his campaign. This will be his campaign.
He's not going to be out of the courtroom a whole lot during especially the spring and the summer. He'll be sitting in various trials. The bigger concern I have is, what if he actually does get convicted? What if this does get to sentencing before the election?
How likely?
Getting to sentencing before the election?
Any of them.
If I'm a lot more confident that the DC case makes it to trial than I am the Florida case, just because Judge Cannon is a wild card. I'm not as one who necessarily views her as, in the bag for Trump. I think she made a really bad decision, a year ago, and I said so at the time. But since the indictment came down, she hasn't done anything substantively wrong as far as I viewed it. I think she's moved a bit slow. There's a bunch of pending motions in Florida right now to try to push this thing off again until after the election. I want to see what she does. But DC, I don't see Judge Chutkan letting this thing drag out too much longer. I see that one getting to trial and to either conviction or acquittal before the convention in the summer. It's going to be a really difficult situation that we have no precedent for, no guiding, guidepost for of what do we do in that situation.
If a conviction, Brad, he can appeal.
He can appeal, and even if convicted, there is nothing in the Constitution that says he can't still win the presidency,
Right.
and take office. It would be a constitutional kerfuffle. I mean, we have no idea how to deal with it as a society, but nothing in the Constitution prevents it. He could be convicted 12 times and still become president because the Constitution doesn't restrict him in terms of his criteria to become president. But yeah, this is what the public's going to be struggling with. And I don't think most of the American public is really tuned into it yet, that we're all dealing with our own lives. But as we get closer to the end of spring, early summer, when the campaign really starts getting into gear for the general public, dealing with this of, do we want this person, no matter what comes out of these trials, do we want this person as president again? And if the public decides it does, we have no idea how to handle this.
So I hate Trump, but I have a real problem with any gag orders. And I suppose I would lean toward, man, it's got to be any gag order's got to be as narrow as possible. Let him speak. On that spectrum, Brad Moss, as a lawyer, where do you fall?
I generally am in favor of keeping it as narrow as possible because I don't want to, even if that's not necessarily for a legal purpose, for a political one. I don't need to give him any more martyrdom complex than he's already got. If you're going to put a gag order, it's got to remain narrow. It's got to remain focused because otherwise also it gives him issues for appeal that you don't want to do. The narrow gag order that Jack Smith is seeking, I don't really see this being a problem for him other than he can't attack Milley or Pence or any of those people. You know, it probably will be a similar one sought in Georgia, depending on what happens if some of his various co-defendants start flipping on him. I'm looking at you, Sidney Powell. I'm looking at you, Rudy Giuliani. I could see him trying to attack them. But, you know, beyond that, I'm happy to let him run his mouth. He just buries himself more every time he does. There was just a poll that came out this morning. I can't remember who. It wasn't Marist. I forget who the pollster was, listing all these different areas of topics in which the public trusted Donald Trump over Joe Biden. Yet the voting preference was still Biden over Trump. Why? Because the public can't stand Donald Trump.
Do you have a problem with a gag order potentially limiting, say, what he can say about Milley or Pence? Pence, a fellow candidate for the nomination.
I don't have a problem with that in the sense that you are a criminal defendant. You can't attack witnesses. We don't allow this for gang members. We don't allow this for accused murderers. We don't allow this for drug kingpins. We're not going to allow it for Donald Trump. I don't care you are a candidate for office. Right now, you're a private citizen with no other authorities or privileges. You will be held to the same standard that everybody else is. And if that means it's harder for you to respond to an attack on a debate stage, too bad.
That's interesting, Brad, and I get it.
Yeah.
You're basically saying, look, this is the price Trump's got to pay for being a criminal defendant.
Yeah.
His speech is going to be limited.
Yeah. And if he was smart, he would have a great line. I mean, he's never going to be on a debate stage with Mike Pence anyways, because Pence is going to be gone in a few months from the whole thing. And if he debates anybody, it might be Nikki Haley or DeSantis. But, you know, he should have a great line in terms of responding, saying, I can't respond. I can't address, Mike, what you're saying, because there's a judge in D.C. who will throw me in jail. But let me say that I defended the country when you didn't have the courage, you know, yada, yada. This is Donald Trump. He's the great, you know, one-liners. He should have a ready-made line for that. It shouldn't be any problem for him.
He's just not that smart, not that disciplined. You tweeted yesterday or the day before that you do, in fact, expect a number of gag orders. Do you? Why?
Partially because as this stuff becomes more real for him, as it's not just indictments now, but there are people already starting to plead guilty. The trials are approaching in the coming months. The reality of possibly being convicted and sent to prison becomes more real. He's becoming more irrational. His commentary is getting crazier and crazier. And it's hard to keep that in perspective given how crazy his 4 years were. I mean, he tried to get my boss executed during the whistleblower impeachment stuff. He tried to get the whistleblower, you know, killed, you know, but his rhetoric has just become more and more unhinged. And as we get closer and closer to these trials and as the reality kicks in, I expect he will continue to make outrageous remarks about witnesses, about the judge and the judge's staff, about prosecutors and their staff. And so I expect there will be other gag orders. This won't be the first. This won't be the last.
For the record, I oppose these I oppose this gag order. I oppose any gag order. But my bigger concern, Brad, you alluded to, is this shit's going to help him politically big time. And I worry that it's going to help him with Americans outside of his crazy base, who many of whom, and I've already heard from some of these folks, independents, who just have a free speech problem with this, and they don't understand, like I didn't understand, that criminal defendants are limited. Jack Smith, these prosecutors understand the political aspect of this, don't they?
Yeah, and that's part of the reason I think they have treated this so gently up till now. That's why they let him out and then try to seek, have him detained pending trial like they would have done with any other espionage act, defendant. Look, Jack Teixeira, he's still sitting in jail. Every, Reality Winner went straight to jail after she was arrested.
Yeah.
She was never let out. All of them go to jail pending trial. They don't get let out like Trump was. So yes, I'm sure Jack Smith has that in the back of his mind. I'm sure that was something they had to consider before seeking this limited gag order. But there has to be a point where they say, we are not the political branch or political portion of the executive branch. We are the law enforcement portion. Our job is to enforce the law, no matter what the ultimate politics. That's for others to contend with. We deal with the law.
You worry about the politics, though, don't you?
Yes, I do. And I agree with you in the sense that the short-term benefit for him politically is immense. If there was any doubt that he would win the nomination, it was gone the moment he started getting indicted, because none of the other candidates have a real response for it. Not to mention, I don't really view any of the other defendants as being all that much on his level. None of them had a great response or great answer for it, and the base came to his defense. His problem is that these indictments are burying him with the people who will vote in the general election, particularly suburban women, particularly college-educated voters, the people that the Republican Party lost in the era of Trump, and they're not getting back by running a guy facing 4 different indictments.
Okay, my fear. Answer my fear, though, Mister. That either the DC case, but an acquittal on one of these sometime next year, and he becomes a martyr on steroids.
Yes, he does.
With more people than just his base.
Yeah, if he is acquitted on any of these cases, but not to mention if he's acquitted on both federal cases, his stock goes through the roof, and that could very well propel him back to the White House. You know what? It's the way the cookie crumbles if that's what happens. The Justice Department had very viable and very legitimate cases in both circumstances. I can't describe enough how much the Florida case, more than anything, angers me, given what he did and given how my clients could never get away with stuff like that. And it's not just, and everybody says, oh, he was allowed to take them with him. I was like, let's just say that he mistakenly took them or whatever. The moment they start showing up with subpoenas, you turn it back over, or you move to quash a subpoena. You don't try to get one guy to hide boxes. You don't get another guy to try to delete videotape. That is evidence to me of a guilty mind, that you can't have this, and you're trying to obstruct justice. That's what ticks me off.
Don't you think that Florida case is the most clear-cut?
It is. It's the most clear-cut, and I don't care if it's in Fort Pierce or wherever the courthouse is. I don't care how Republican the area is. I think if that gets to trial, I think he gets convicted. His only hope there is a hung jury. I don't see any way to acquittal for him, because the facts are so clear-cut, and I expect at least one, if not both of his co-defendants, will ultimately flip on him once the pretrial motions are dealt with. But yeah, that should be the most clean-cut case. The only wild card is it's Judge Cannon and Fort Pierce. Yeah,
does a hung jury, instinctively it just tells me that helps him politically too.
Yeah, well, anything short of a conviction helps him. And even a guilty conviction in some way will help him with his base. I mean, it will rally his people behind him. But to the extent that these details come out, and particularly the Georgia case, to the extent that those details get publicized in daily trial hearings, the public is going to see that. Even if he's ultimately not found guilty, even if he's gets a hung jury, the public will have seen those details. That is going to anger them more. Nothing angers Americans more than someone trying to take away their ability to vote.
He'll be, Brad, realistically, he'll be in a courtroom for a good chunk of next year.
Yes, which is the biggest problem for him.
But probably, maybe, but look what he did this week. And he didn't have to be there this week. But he can't these were campaign appearances.
Yes.
He held court outside of the courtroom at every break.
Yeah. Now, mind you, in the federal courthouses, he's not going to be able to do that inside the court building. He could go outside, which he's not going to want to do. Georgia, he can try to do those little things. I don't know what their specific rules might be in terms of holding sway like he did in New York. But in Georgia, the case is going to be televised. People can sit there and watch it, all day long if they want to. They'll hear what's going on. So his ability to try to spin things afterwards will be diminished. But look, Donald Trump is going to do his thing. He's going to give little campaign speeches from the courthouse every day he can. He's going to try to point to himself as being, the subject of this political persecution. He was going to do that no matter what. The law can't just stand aside because it might be politically inconvenient. Either we have a law that applies or it doesn't.
His biggest argument, and I hear it from his base every day, this is all election interference. Mm-hmm. Have you ever thought, Brad, that it would make sense to push all of these off beyond the 24 election to take that argument of his off the table?
No, because one, it's ridiculous. But two, here's the reason why. If it's election interference, it's also election interference to deprive the public of knowing what actually occurred.
That's a great point.
Whether or not he actually committed these crimes is of value and of interest to Americans when deciding whether or not to vote for him come November 2024, if he is in fact the nominee. To deprive Americans of that information would be in itself election interference. And so as far as the Justice Department was concerned, they basically had to say, look, he's going to make these attacks no matter what. They could have filed the indictment a week after January 6th. He would have made these kinds of complaints saying, I'm going to be the candidate in 2024. He was always going to make that complaint. They had to look at it as, do we have a case? Is it the kind of case we would normally bring? Can we get a conviction at trial? Yes? Okay, we're bringing the case.
Did any of these cases, it's the other thing I hear, wait too long to be brought? Like, Joe, where the fuck was Jack Smith a year ago? I hear shit like that all the time.
Well, bear in mind, Jack Smith wasn't even really around yet a year ago. Yeah. The search warrant, so let's say the Florida case, they gave him over a year trying to just get the documents back. I'm reading these NARA letters. They're being very polite, doing what you would expect them to do. They don't want to make a criminal case out of this, saying, hey, these are our documents. Where are they? It takes a year to even give them back anything. And then it's 6 or 7 more months of fighting with him over a subpoena before they finally say enough is enough. And they go and get the search warrant. It then took months dealing with the special master issue, dealing with the special counsel coming on board, fighting through various privilege arguments to have the lawyers and other people testifying before the grand juries. It takes time. People think everything is like Law and Order, where you see the crime happen, they arrest them 2 days later, and they're in trial, on the substance, 60 seconds later with, I can't believe I can't forget his name now, with Jack McCoy. It's not like that in real life. It takes a while. That was the problem with the Florida case. Same thing with the January 6th, the election interference case. They had to deal with all the initial people who had just gotten into the building to prosecute them. Then they had to deal with the seditious conspiracy trials, and they won those. Then they finally had the ability, after getting through, again, privilege and constitutional arguments with people like Mike Pence, to bring enough information before a grand jury to decide whether or not to seek an indictment. It takes time. The fact that it was 2.5 years to go through all that on January 6th, pretty darn lightning speed for the Justice Department, which doesn't move fast.
Answer this as best you can. To me, Brad, the Florida case, like a total self-enforced error. Totally on him. Why did Trump, it was so easy not to do. Why do you think he held that shit and tried to hide it and obstructed the return of it?
So here's what I've said all along is, when people ask why did he have it, because everybody kept asking, is he trying to sell it? I go, no. Donald Trump loves mementos. He wanted to show things off, see how cool I was, see what I had. He wanted to show that stuff off. That's why he originally had it. Why did he start playing games when they came knocking on his door asking for the documents back?
Right.
Because various people, Tom Fitton comes to mind, started whispering in his ear, you don't have to. And Donald Trump didn't listen to the former White House lawyers. They didn't listen to the personal lawyers saying, no, you got to give it back. He said, well, this guy says I can tell him to go pound sand, and I love to tell authorities to go pound sand, so I'm just not going to comply. Or here, give him some stuff so I can say I complied, but don't give him these other boxes. That's Donald Trump being Donald Trump. He thought the law didn't apply to him. Think about all the stuff he got away with for decades out in New York. He thought he thought there were no rules.
Which of these 4 indictments legally, in your mind, is the biggest threat to him?
The biggest threat to him has got to be the Georgia case, and here's why. It doesn't matter what happens in the election. If he gets convicted in Georgia, there is no way for him to pardon himself. There's no way for the Georgia governor, who hates him anyways, but there's no way for the Georgia governor to pardon him. It's all run by a state commission that won't even consider it until you've already been serving time in jail. So if he gets convicted there, he's going to serve jail. It's just a question of when.
That's fascinating. And can he appeal that ruling?
Of course he can.
Okay.
He'll lose.
He'll lose. The January 6th case, is that going to be, I mean, look, he incited, there'd be no January 6th if he didn't do what he did. But criminally, is that going to be a tougher lift for Jack Smith?
If it gets the trial, I'm confident there's a conviction. The big questions, which I'm sure that Jack Smith's already had to pregame out, is the pretrial motions. Because there are a lot of larger abstract legal issues that will come into play that will have been dispensed with one way or the other if this gets the trial. There's going to be issues of executive immunity. There's going to be issues about First Amendment ability to, First Amendment and Sixth Amendment ability to seek guidance from counsel. There's going to be selective prosecution. That's all going to get addressed in pretrial motions. If he fails there, then Jack Smith's going to get what's called a motion in limine to exclude Trump from being able to raise that at trial. And he'll get that motion approved. Because those arguments have been thrown out.
Doesn't get to trial? What are the odds that one doesn't get to trial?
The only way I see that not getting trial is Trump somehow gets either before Judge Chutkan or on appeal, seeks an immediate emergency appeal, somehow gets one of these immunity arguments to hold up. I'm skeptical of it, but we're in uncharted territory. There is no precedent for a former president being prosecuted for activities he took while president. We don't know for certain how courts, especially the Supreme Court, would rule. We know what they ruled, when it came to Nixon, but it wasn't a criminal matter. It was a civil matter at the time, and the court looks very different than it did in 1973. So we have no idea how this court would view it. So far, they've given Trump nothing in terms of his various appeals to them. They have not been willing to even consider his appeals to have his cases heard before them. But if he gets convicted, I just don't know.
Last question, Brad, going back to the gag orders. Again, as a non-lawyer and a free speech absolutist, I'm so troubled by gag orders. But as a lawyer, is there any aspect of the gag order that troubles you?
The current one, the New York one, no.
Not that one, just in general.
I mean, gag orders in general, you don't want to be restricting people's rights unless there's an absolute necessity and a compelling interest. There's always going to be circumstances where it's going to be necessary. And I don't like, which thankfully didn't happen here, I don't like when prosecutors try to proactively do it before anything's occurred based off stuff that happened before an indictment. What I generally want to see is them wait till the person does something, basically a self-inflicted wound after indictment. That's what happened with Donald Trump here. That's why I think there will be this limited gag order coming out of D.C. It's because what he did after indictment. He went before the judge. She explained the ground rules. He said, yep, I understand. And he went right home and did the exact same thing he wasn't supposed to do.
Isn't this gag order and any future gag order, because it's Trump, inherently difficult to enforce?
It'll be difficult to enforce in the sense of what do we do if and when he violates it? Because for anybody else, for you and me, they just throw us in prison. Trump, it's not so easy to do that for no other reason than he's entitled under the law to Secret Service protection. And I'm not just sticking these poor Secret Service guys into any random prison jail. If he's convicted and he gets that protection, it's going to be like a private facility to himself. So even if this gag order is put in place and even if he violates it, I'm not sure yet how it'll be enforced. I think what Judge Chutkan will do was just say, fine, you want to violate my order? I'm moving the trial up to January.
Oh.
She's warned about this before,
Yeah.
that she could just accelerate the trial schedule. She's not going to let him play this game. He's going to get every due process right. He's going to get to challenge everything he wants. He's going to get the discovery he's entitled to. He's not going to get to play games with the court.
Do you have a sense, Brad?
About
his head.
I'm about to say, I was like, I'm a lawyer, not really.
Do you have a sense which indictment scares Trump the most? If you had to guess.
The only reason I want, and that's not much the indictment, but the prosecution. The only one I wanted to say is Georgia, because it's televised, because people can see it. And Donald Trump is the master of captive television. In the federal cases, no one's going to see it. It's just going to be notes that come out for reporters. The Georgia case, that's OJ 2.0. They're going to watch this day in and day out.
That's a great point. You're going to be busy the next 14 months.
Yeah, sadly, yes.
Bradley Moss, National Security Attorney. Follow him on Twitter at Brad Moss ESQ. Follow Brad Moss on Twitter. Just a great, fascinating, interesting follow. Thank you, my friend.
Anytime. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.